Digitalisation is a buzzword that is peppering conversations within utilities. But what does it really mean in a practical way? What are the benefits? Why is this topic important now? And how does digitalisation fit in with the new dynamics between utility and consumer? Today, we are going to be considering all of these and more. I'm Nicolette Pomper-van-Zyl, editor of ESI Africa, and it's my pleasure to be speaking with Philip Dingle, the marketing director at Lucy Electric, about what digitalisation means in the context of Africa's utility landscape. An on-demand version of this discussion will be available on the Digital African Utility Week and PowerGen Africa website. And you can also access this via your Digital Energy Festival profile. Phil, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, welcome, Nicolette. Pleasure to be here. Looking forward to an entertaining discussion.
So, Phil, at the ESI Africa News Desk, we have observed a keen focus on smart applications emerging, which you could say is a shift to a digital Africa. As you're at the forefront of this market, why are we speaking about digitalization in the first place?
Okay, so I think first of all, it's important to do a little bit of scene setting here. The concept of digitization links to what was originally portrayed as the 3Ds, or now being talked of as the 4Ds. So this starts with decarbonisation. So this is the whole climate change agenda, decarbonisation of our activities, our transport, our heating, etc. Now, linked to that is the second of the Ds, which is decentralisation. And this is very much the move to renewable generation, the solar, wind, etc., that we're seeing in many markets. The third leg of that, the third D, is digitisation. And this is the ability to connect and control and manage all of those activities. And the fourth D is democratization. And this is really the move from a central monopolistic utility to a more fragmented, deregulated electricity network. And a really good recent example of that is the economic recovery plan announced in South Africa that actually puts more emphasis on local renewables and provides the municipal utilities the ability to be able to generate their own power.
Right, so now that we understand how the 4Ds fit into it, what do we mean by digitization for an African market?
So first of all, in the context of what we do at Lucy Electric, I'm going to focus on the distribution side of the smart meter. And there's lots of talk around digitization and the value and the benefits that can be pulled from smart meters, and I'll leave others to talk about that. When we look about digitization and in terms of the networks, it's how we can bring the ability to monitor, control multiple assets in one structured way, so that we have a structured network, but it is able to deliver at a local level.
So we want to also talk about why does digitization matter to consumers and the society, and what do they want from the electrical network?
So I think first and foremost, there's been lots of talk and political leadership about the benefits of electrification of the population in terms of that growth driver for economic development of the population. It's an absolute cornerstone to that. Through electrification, people can perform work, they can perform functions during the daytime, use of motors, all of that good stuff. But also then when we move into the evening, to the night time, in terms of bars, restaurants, working, lifestyles at home, continuing production overnight. So there's the whole piece around the societal gain by the electrification of the community. Now, the next level of that is, having created the network, it then needs to be stable. What we've seen in many countries, load shedding, the network's unreliable. So what do people forced to do then? They're having to buy to either resource their own local generator sets, or effectively accept that they have no power and revert back to doing nothing. So to some respect, having an unreliable power source is almost worse than having none, because you can't plan. And certainly if you're a startup business and you're trying to develop and grow, you need to be putting your assets, your cash into the growth of that business, not spending it on gen sets, other means of supporting your electricity. So it's absolutely fundamental that the network is reliable. And that's the next level of moving through this electrification of the community. Now, in terms of delivery of that, clearly there's been a lot of talk, but it needs a very joined up strategy between the government expectations, their strategy for rural electrification that we've seen in many countries in Kenya and others across Africa, but also linked to the utilities and their plans. And this fundamentally links to a point we'll discuss later on when we talk about the cost benefit of doing this. And it's very much this link between government and society. Mm-hmm. If I take a stage further and paint the picture of what does digitization mean in a more mature market? And if I look at London, the southeast of England, the utility there that covers that area, UKPN, they estimate at the moment that they have some 200,000 independent generators connected to their network. Now those generators can be anything from small scale, less than 7 kilowatt rooftop PV on a residential home, through to 5 megawatt scale PV farms, to onshore wind farms, to some offshore, to anaerobic digestion plants, and also including standby generators, flexibility services that are connected in the economic centre of London. So that gives a very broad feel of the complexity of where the networks are going, and hence the need for digitization to be able to manage that complexity.
So Phil, can you give us some examples that we can look into in terms of rural electrification?
Yeah, so I think if we take the concept of the deployment of renewables, particularly solar wind that we're seeing now in South Africa starting to come into many other markets, the use of geothermal in the Rift Valley. If we then take that to another market such as Australia, where they've already deployed 22,000 batteries at a local level to provide that grid flexibility and support, then what we're then very quickly able to see that through the deployment of those flexible resources, the direction of travel, the image of how the network will develop in Africa suddenly doesn't seem that remote from what I described for the southeast of England. You know, it's all about building that flexibility of resource across that democratized geography.
Right. That's very important in terms of understanding what digitalization can offer, is looking at other markets. But this brings me to something that the utilities are always asking: what are the cost benefits of digitalization?
So I think here is a tricky one. There's a purist finance view that would say, linked to your business, there's a direct ROI that you can calculate. And a really good example of that is well known, well understood within the utility industry is the impact of customer minutes lost, customers disconnected. Now, that's a figure that we all know, we all understand, but how that is implemented and driven is very much comes from the government or the regulator. So everyone has targets. It then depends whether those targets are just nice targets or they are linked to specific fines. Now, if the utilities, and in many countries, the fines are very real and very expensive, and therefore actually the return on investment comes from making sure they don't hit those fines, they meet their targets. So again, it's this dialogue between the utilities and the regulator in terms of driving that right behaviour. Now, if we want to then move on into the other benefits of the flexibility, the sustainability, again, the sustainability agenda is very much a government and society one. And therein lies the challenge for the utilities in terms of they are absolutely key players in this story, but how do they structure their return on investment based on government ambition?
And in terms of the focus on loss reduction, that is something that smart energy can realize for the utilities, not so?
Yeah, so very much so. And going back to one of my earlier points, the wealth creation, I mean, if society benefits from having access to electricity, it means society has to pay for the electricity. It's a resource, any other fuel that we use. So the challenge of losses is very real across many, not just Africa, many other countries. So at this point, I will bring in the smart meter, because through the use of smart meter data and the use of data within the networks, and data will become an important aspect of the networks as we move forward, then the identification of those areas where there is theft, commercial loss taking place is much easier to focus on and then to try and reduce. Now, the challenge also from a societal point of view there, though, is there will be people which are at the edge of society that are at risk. And there is an obligation there for society to support those. And that, again, is a common theme with many other utilities. How do you balance that revenue stream, but also look after vulnerable customers?
So Phil, looking at a bit of a futuristic outlook for the African network, where do you see expansion likely to take place?
So I think, first of all, we're going to see an expansion of the renewable generation, deployment at scale in many, many locations across the network. That variability then has to be matched with the variability of consumer demand. So that in itself requires active network management. And then what we're going to see, I think, much further down the line from an African point of view, is the growth of electric vehicles. And that's very real in Europe. And just to give you an indication again of direction of travel of where these things are going. In many of the European countries, Germany, for example, there's a ban on the sale of new petrol and diesel cars from 2030. So if you think Germany is the home of a lot of the automotive industry, Mercedes, BMW, VW, etc. In support of that, the German government has invested 4 billion euros in EV. So 2 billion in creation of cars and 2 billion in infrastructure. So when we talk about EV, is it coming? To me, that says it's real if that's what Germany's are doing. So that level of flexibility, that level of variability is absolutely critical going forward, which further emphasizes the need for the digitization.
And digitization is something that can lend itself to African countries implementing EV technology, EV charging stations, and then adding to the variability on the network.
Yeah, exactly. And again, there are many trials, there's many applications out there. We're already seeing people linking EV charging to solar sites and battery storage, almost making them grid independent. There's a large site just outside of London where they're doing that. That is easily deployable anywhere in Africa. And what you're already seeing in some parts of South Africa is EV chargers from Jaguar being put up. So it's happening, it's very early days, but again, it's part of the story that needs to be considered as we move into this decarbonised world.
Phil, where do you see utilities starting with implementing digitalization? Would it be on the transmission side of the network or the distribution side? Where should they focus?
I think as we move forward in this evolution of the network, as I've said, we're going to see deployment of renewables in many locations, battery storage, consumers variability across a broad geographic range in Africa. Therefore, as common with many industries we see, the control, the digitization needs to take place at the lowest level possible in the network. So we're talking down into the distribution level. The control, the monitoring control needs to be relevant at a local level. And I think that's the important piece that people need to work through to say, how do they migrate to having that digital network in place at a lower level rather than the very much the top end focus.
That is an important aspect to point out, is that you need to have a sustainable business, but you also need to deliver a service to all of your customers. So Phil, what last thoughts do you have or comments do you have for our utility listeners on the topic of digitalization?
So I think, as I've said, I think there is increasing electrification is first and foremost absolutely critical. There's been huge success made in many countries across Africa, but there's still a lot more to do. That process of electrification has to embrace digitization to deliver the flexibility and the reliability that the consumers require. I've also touched on data. The growth of data will heavily influence the way that our understanding of the network grows, where we should invest. One of the key things as we move through this whole digitization process is right decisions, right time, avoiding the concept of stranded assets. And we've all seen through the development of the digital world we now exist in with computers, with mobile phones, that some of that can become very redundant very quickly. And therein lies a real challenge for the utilities to make sure that there are no stranded assets. Another key aspect here is that growth of the electrification, the growth of renewables, the growth of digitization requires different skills, but it also creates jobs. And again, what we're seeing in many markets is the linkage of the move to electrification with a green recovery, the ability to create a society for the future, but also those jobs. And that is a very real challenge for many countries now as we work through the pandemic, is how to create those sustainable jobs. And building the electric infrastructure is a key means of doing that. Finally, in terms of the utilities, as I've said, there are, in all the markets we touch on, they are all heading in this direction in one way or another. Each country is starting from a slightly different place, and their direction to travel, their rate of change will vary, but ultimately it's similar. Therefore, there is a lot of learning from many companies, many utilities, many people such as ourselves on how to work our way through the future challenges of what digitization can bring to the network.
Right. That's a very important final message that you have left with us. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, Phil, and spending the past half hour talking about digitalization with us. As you've heard, digitalization is also about how the 4Ds fit into Africa's smart energy future, economic development, and the flexibility that it offers for utilities and consumers alike. Be sure to tune in for other sessions that are part of the Digital Energy Festival. We have a number of sessions coming up, including another discussion on digitalization and reimagining your utility. how mini-grid providers are building resilient incomes and negotiating tenable PPAs between IPPs and private buyers. Also, be sure to keep up to date with the latest developments on the ESI Africa website, where you will find up-to-date news on the delivery of the African Utility Week and PowerGen Africa in 2021. Thank you so much for joining us. Please continue to take care of yourself and keep safe. Goodbye.